the Tower of London, summer of 1483. In the shadows of an unknown room, within the cold, ancient walls of that fortress that had been a royal palace, a state prison, and a place of execution, two children, two princes of royal blood, disappear without a trace, as if swallowed up by the shadows of history. Edward V, the young King of England, barely 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, 9, sons of the late King Edward IV, are seen playing in the gardens of the Tower, then confined to their quarters, and finally vanish from the world of the living, leaving behind a terrifying silence and an enigma that has tormented the conscience of England for more than 5 centuries. What became of the princes in the Tower? Were they murdered, as many suspected from the outset, and as Shakespearean tradition has engraved in the popular imagination? And if so, who ordered their death? All eyes then and now turned to a shadowy, ambitious, and controversial figure, their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Lord Protector of the kingdom, who after the disappearance of his nephews would soon usurp the throne and crown himself Richard III. Was Richard the hunchbacked, bloodthirsty monster portrayed by Tudor propaganda, a tyrant capable of murdering his own nephews to secure his crown? Or was he the victim of a smear campaign, a king vilified by his enemies, and the fate of the princes a much more complex mystery with other possible culprits? This is the chronicle of a disappearance that became one of the greatest unsolved crimes in English history, the story of 2 innocent children caught up in the maelstrom of the struggle for power, and the enigma that still surrounds their final fate. Join me as I unravel the secrets of the Bloody Tower, explore the intrigues of the War of the Roses, and attempt to shed some light on the dark fate of the princes in the Tower. Was their death an act of cold statecraft, a family tragedy, or a mystery that we may never fully unravel? The question, like an echo in the corridors of the Tower, continues to resonate through the centuries, demanding an answer that may lie hidden beneath the stones of their infamous prison. To understand the full tragic dimension of the mystery of the princes in the Tower's disappearance and the complex political and dynastic forces that may have converged in their alleged murder, it is absolutely essential that we first immerse ourselves in late 15th century England, a nation deeply scarred by decades of brutal and bloody civil conflict known as the War of the Roses, approximately 1455 to 1487. A fierce struggle for the throne of England between 2 rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster, whose emblem was the red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was the white rose. This war, characterized by extreme violence, constant betrayals, reversals of fortune, and the annihilation of much of the old English nobility, had left the country exhausted, divided, and deeply suspicious of any sign of dynastic instability or weakness on the throne. In this context of political instability and often shifting loyalties, King Edward IV of the House of York had managed to impose himself after years of struggle and thanks to his undoubted charisma and military skill. Edward, a handsome, courageous man with a taste for pleasure, had reigned with a firm hand, but also with a certain tendency toward indulgence and amorous scandals, which did not always contribute to the stability of his regime. One of his most controversial acts, with the most lasting consequences, was his secret marriage in 1464 to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of noble but relatively modest origins with a large and ambitious family. This marriage, made for love, but against the advice of his principal advisers, such as the powerful Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, who preferred a marriage alliance with a foreign princess, offended a significant part of the traditional nobility and sowed the seeds of future discord, as the Woodville family soon monopolized positions, wealth, and influence at court, generating envy and resentment. From his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV had several children, including 2 sons who would initially secure the succession of the House of York. Edward, born in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey in 1470, during a brief period when his father had been deposed and exiled, and Richard, Duke of York, born in Shrewsbury in 1473. These 2 children, raised in the luxury and opulence of the court, but also under the constant shadow of civil war and palace intrigues, were destined to become the tragic protagonists of our story. Their childhood, although privileged, was not without its ups and downs. Their father, Edward IV, had to fight several times to keep his crown, facing rebellions by the Lancastrians and betrayals by some of his former allies. However, from 1471 onwards, after the decisive victory at Tewkesbury and the death of the last Lancaster pretender, Henry VI, and his son, Prince Edward of Westminster, Edward VII's reign seemed to consolidate, and a period of relative peace and prosperity began for England. The young Prince Edward, invested with the title of Prince of Wales, was carefully educated to assume his future responsibilities as king. He was assigned renowned tutors, such as Anthony Woodville, Earl of Rivers, the Queen's brother, a cultured and refined man, but also ambitious and belonging to the hated Woodville clan. The young prince grew up at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where he learned the rudiments of government and the military arts, although his character, according to some chroniclers, was rather docile and perhaps somewhat naive for the turbulent times he was to live through. His younger brother, Richard of York, also lived in the court environment, although with a less prominent role. The sudden and unexpected death of King Edward IV on April 9, 1483, at the age of only 40, probably as a result of pneumonia or some other acute infection aggravated by his excessive eating and drinking, plunged the kingdom once again into uncertainty and a deep political crisis. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, automatically became King Edward V, but at only 12 years of age, a period of minority began that required the appointment of a Lord Protector of the kingdom. Two main factions immediately fought for control of the young king and the government. On one side was the family of the Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, led by her brother Anthony, Earl of Rivers, and her son from a first marriage, Thomas Grey, Marquess of Dorset, who sought to seize power and secure their influence over the new monarch. On the other side was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of the late Edward IV, a man in his 30s, with proven loyalty to his brother during the civil wars, great military and administrative skills, but also, according to his detractors, boundless ambition and a cold and calculating character. Richard of Gloucester, who was in northern England at the time of his brother's death, was appointed in Edward IV's will as Lord Protector of the kingdom during his nephew's minority. However, the Woodville faction, fearing the loss of their power and influence, attempted to marginalize him and rule in the name of the young king. The first signs of an inevitable clash between the Lord Protector and the Queen Dowager's family soon became apparent. Richard, with the support of some influential nobles who also distrusted the power of the Woodvilles, such as the Duke of Buckingham and Lord Hastings, acted quickly and decisively. He intercepted the young Edward V on his way from Ludlow to London, arrested his main Woodville companions, including the Earl of Rivers and Lord Richard Grey, another son of the Queen, and seized effective control of the king and the government. The Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, terrified by these events and fearing for the safety of her other children, hastily took refuge in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey with her youngest son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. Tension in London was at its height. Richard of Gloucester was formally proclaimed Lord Protector, but his authority was still precarious, and his position threatened by the intrigues of the Woodvilles and uncertainty about his true intentions. A new enigma was beginning to take shape at the English court. Would Richard be content to be the loyal protector of his nephew, or did he aspire to something more, to the crown of England itself? And a symbolic object, the Tower of London, that imposing fortress on the banks of the Thames that had served over the centuries as a royal palace, a state prison, and a place of execution, would become the main stage for the tragedy that was about to unfold, a place where the fate of two young princes would be sealed forever in mystery and infamy. The downward spiral that would lead the young princes Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, from the apparent safety of their royal lineage to their mysterious and tragic disappearance in the depths of the Tower of London, was a rapid, relentless, and meticulously orchestrated process in which political ambition, legal manipulation, and covert violence were sinisterly intertwined. Having seized control of the young King Edward V and neutralized the leading members of the Woodville faction, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, now Lord Protector of the kingdom, began to consolidate his power in London with a mixture of political skill and heavy-handedness. He summoned a parliament and a royal council that were favorable to him, and set about winning the support of the nobility and the influential city of London, presenting himself as the guarantor of order and stability at a time of crisis. However, his position remained vulnerable. As long as his nephew Edward V lived and was recognized as the legitimate king, Richard would be nothing more than a temporary regent, and his power would depend on the will of the young monarch or the intrigues of his enemies. Furthermore, the existence of a second male heir, the young Richard, Duke of York, who was sheltered with his mother in Westminster Abbey, further complicated the situation. To ensure his absolute control, and perhaps to pave the way for his own royal ambitions, Richard of Gloucester took a series of crucial and increasingly controversial decisions. First, he convinced, or rather pressured, the widowed Queen Elizabeth Woodville to hand over her youngest son, the Duke of York, on the promise that he would be reunited with his brother Edward V in the Tower of London, which was then still used as a royal residence as well as a fortress and prison. The official pretext was that the two brothers needed to be together to prepare for Edward V's imminent coronation, scheduled for the end of June. Isolated, frightened, and perhaps deceived by Richard's false promises, Elizabeth Woodville reluctantly agreed to hand over her youngest son, an act she would bitterly regret for the rest of her life. Thus, in mid-June 1483, the two young princes, Edward V, aged 12, and Richard of York, aged 9, were confined together in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, under the strict custody of the Lord Protector's trusted men. Although they were initially allowed visitors and treated with the respect due to their rank, their isolation from the outside world was progressive and increasingly complete. Little by little, they were no longer seen playing in the Tower gardens, and rumors about their fate began to circulate insistently throughout London and the kingdom. Meanwhile, Richard of Gloucester and his allies, especially the ambitious and devious Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford, wasted no time. They began to spread a propaganda campaign aimed at discrediting the legitimacy of the two princes and preparing the ground for Richard's usurpation of the throne. The main argument put forward was that the marriage between the late King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal and void, since it was claimed Edward IV had previously been betrothed, a pre-marriage contract which, according to the canon law of the time, invalidated any subsequent marriage to another lady, Lady Eleanor Butler. If this was true, all children born of the union between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, including the two princes, would be bastards and therefore ineligible to inherit the crown. This surprising and convenient revelation was publicly proclaimed in a sermon delivered at St. Paul's Cross by Dr. Ralph Shaw, brother of the Lord Mayor of London and supporter of Richard. Shortly thereafter, Parliament, conveniently pressured and manipulated, passed an act known as Titulus Regius, which formally declared the illegitimacy of the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and offered the crown to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as the only legitimate heir of the House of York. The escalation of events was dizzying. On June 26, 1483, barely 2.5 months after the death of Edward IV, Richard of Gloucester was proclaimed King of England under the name Richard III. His coronation took place on July 6 at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony of great pomp and splendor, but also surrounded by an atmosphere of tension and ill omens. Many influential nobles, such as Lord Stanley, attended reluctantly or were conspicuously absent. While Richard III donned the crown of England, his two nephews, the legitimate heirs according to the previous order of succession, languished forgotten and increasingly isolated in the depths of the Tower of London. The last reliable news of them dates from mid-July 1483, when witnesses claimed to have seen them playing in the inner courtyards of the tower, or looking sadly out of the windows of their chambers. After that date, silence. The two princes disappeared completely from public view and from official records. What became of them? Did they die of illness, as suggested in some circles close to the new king? Were they secretly sent abroad, as claimed by some impostors who emerged years later, such as Perkin Warbeck, pretending to be the Duke of York? Or were they, as most contemporaries and later historians have suspected, murdered on the orders of their uncle, King Richard III, to eliminate any possible threat to his newly usurped throne? The murder hypothesis, although never conclusively proven at the time, was the one that gained the most traction, both in England and throughout the rest of Europe. It was rumored that Richard III had ordered one of his most loyal and ruthless servants, Sir James Tyrrell, to get rid of the children. Tyrrell, according to the later account of Thomas More, a historian and humanist who wrote several decades later, under the Tudor reign, and who was openly hostile to the memory of Richard III, had hired two assassins, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, who suffocated the princes with pillows while they slept in their beds, and then secretly buried their bodies somewhere in the tower. This internal hook, the narrative of the alleged murder, although based on later and possibly biased sources, became the canonical version of events and contributed decisively to forging the black legend of Richard III as a monstrous tyrant and murderer of children. However, it is important to note that there is no direct and irrefutable evidence incriminating Richard III in the murder of his nephews. The accusation is based mainly on circumstantial evidence, the testimony of his enemies, and the propaganda of the Tudor dynasty, which succeeded him to the throne after defeating and killing him at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Other possible suspects have been proposed by some revisionist historians, such as the Duke of Buckingham, who rebelled against Richard III shortly after his coronation, and who also had his own distant aspirations to the throne, or even Henry Tudor himself, the future Henry VII, who benefited greatly from the prince's disappearance, as it eliminated two more direct rivals on his path to the crown. Richard III's desperation, paranoia, or denial in the face of the growing wave of rumors and accusations about the fate of his nephews are difficult to assess. Publicly, he never admitted their death or offered a convincing explanation for their whereabouts. This silence, far from silencing suspicions, only served to increase them and fuel the worst conjectures. The downward spiral had closed in not only on the two young princes, but also on the reputation and reign of their uncle, who, guilty or innocent of their disappearance, would forever bear the stigma of being the alleged murderer of the princes in the Tower. The shadow of the executioner, whether a hired assassin acting on direct orders or the cold logic of statecraft dictating the elimination of any obstacle to absolute power, hung relentlessly and definitively over the young and innocent princes in the Tower in that dark and fateful summer of 1483. As the new king, Richard III, consolidated his power after his controversial coronation, the existence of his two nephews, Edward V and Richard of York, confined to the depths of the Tower of London, became an increasingly uncomfortable and dangerous threat to the stability of his newly acquired throne. Although they had been formally declared illegitimate by Parliament through the Titulus Regius Act, their mere physical presence, their royal blood, and the still vivid memory of their father, the popular King Edward IV, represented a potential focus for conspiracies, rebellions, and dynastic claims by those who opposed the new regime or simply longed to restore the direct line of succession of the Yorks. The deterioration of the princes' situation, if one can speak of deterioration when their fate was practically sealed from the moment their uncle usurped the crown, was a process of progressive isolation, gradual silencing, and finally total and absolute disappearance. The most vivid descriptions, though often colored by emotion and bias, of the physical and mental state of the children in their final days of confinement in the Tower come mainly from later sources, such as Thomas More's History of Richard III, written several decades after the events but based, according to him, on the testimony of contemporaries. More paints a moving and heartbreaking picture of two frightened children, alone and aware of their tragic fate. They are said to have spent their hours praying, mourning the death of their father and the betrayal of their uncle, and seeking comfort from each other amid the darkness and abandonment of their prison. The young Edward V, who had been King of England for barely 2 months, is said to have sunk into a deep melancholy, sensing his imminent end. His younger brother, Richard of York, more naive and perhaps less aware of the gravity of the situation, still retained some spark of hope or childish rebellion. The prince's isolation became increasingly strict. If at the beginning of their confinement in the Tower, they had been allowed to receive some visitors, play in the inner courtyards, or even be seen by the public from the windows of their chambers, these concessions gradually disappeared. Little by little, they were no longer seen, and rumors about their fate began to circulate with growing and alarming insistence in the streets of London and throughout the kingdom. It was said that they were ill, that they had been separated, that they had been secretly sent to some remote place, or the most feared and most likely version, that they had been murdered. The reactions of the court, the family, what remained of it that was not in prison or exile, and the people of England to the disappearance of the princes were a mixture of fear, contained indignation, and deep uncertainty. Many nobles, even those who had initially supported Richard III, began to feel uncomfortable and distance themselves from a king on whose head such a terrible suspicion weighed. The Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, who had been forced to surrender her youngest son under false promises, lived in a state of permanent anguish and despair in the sanctuary of Westminster. And the common people, who had generally felt affection for the late Edward IV and his sons, began to see Richard III not as a legitimate king, but as a tyrannical usurper and murderer of children. The last desperate attempts to save the princes, if there were any, proved futile or were brutally suppressed. There are reports of some conspiracies and uprisings in favor of Edward IV's sons, especially in southern England, but they were quickly quelled by Richard III's forces. The machinery of the state was firmly in the hands of the new king, and any opposition was crushed without mercy. The clock ticking towards the prince's death, if it had not already struck, was advancing relentlessly towards its final hour. The intensification of their suffering and the approach of the end were manifested above all in the absolute silence that surrounded their fate from the end of the summer of 1483 onwards. There was no more news, no reliable rumors, no sightings. They simply disappeared. This silence, more eloquent than any words, was interpreted by most as confirmation of their death. The exact date and circumstances of their alleged murder remain one of the great mysteries of English history. The most widespread version, popularized by Shakespeare in his play Richard III, based in turn on the chronicles of Morrow and other Tudor historians, places the crime sometime in the summer of 1483, shortly after Richard's coronation. The king, obsessed with securing his throne and eliminating any possible rivals, allegedly ordered his loyal servant Sir James Tyrrell to get rid of the children. Tyrrell, in turn, allegedly hired two assassins, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, who, taking advantage of the night and the absence of witnesses, entered the room where the princes were sleeping and suffocated them with pillows. Their bodies were then secretly buried somewhere in the tower, perhaps under a staircase or in an unmarked grave. This account, although dramatic and consistent with the image of a tyrannical Richard III, lacks direct and contemporary evidence to confirm it beyond doubt. Other theories suggest that the princes may have died later, perhaps in 1484 or even later, or that they may have been separated and killed in different places. There has also been speculation that Richard III, although ultimately responsible for their disappearance, did not directly order their deaths, but kept them prisoner in a secret location where they died of illness or neglect at the hands of their jailers. Or even, as some revisionists argue, that Richard was not to blame, but rather one of his rivals, such as the Duke of Buckingham or Henry Tudor himself, who would have had their own motives for eliminating the princes. The truth is that from the summer of 1483 onwards, the fate of Edward V and Richard of York is shrouded in absolute darkness, and the shadow of the executioner, in its most cruel and cowardly form, that of the murder of innocent children, is cast over the history of England, leaving an indelible stain and an enigma that continues to challenge historians. The last night, or rather the last weeks and days of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, are shrouded in a veil of mystery as thick and dark as the walls of the fortress that became their prison and, most likely, their tomb. Unlike other royal endings we have explored, where there are detailed chronicles, eyewitness accounts, or even confessions from the executioners, in the case of Edward IV's young sons, we are faced with almost complete silence, a gradual and secretive disappearance that culminated in a total and definitive absence. There was no public death scene, no formal trial, beyond the declaration of their illegitimacy, no official announcement of their death from illness. They simply ceased to be seen, ceased to exist for the outside world, as if they had been swallowed up by the shadows of history. The climax of their tragedy is therefore not a single dramatic moment of execution, but a slow and agonizing agony of uncertainty, isolation, and a childlike terror that we can only imagine. The narrative of their death is, in reality, a reconstruction of their disappearance and an exploration of the theories that attempt to explain it. The last relatively reliable news about the princes being alive dates, as we have mentioned, from mid-July 1483. Dominic Mancini, an Italian humanist who was in London at the time and wrote a report on the events for the Archbishop of Vienne, Angelo Cato, offers us one of the most moving and intimate accounts. Mancini recounts that, after being confined to the inner apartments of the tower, the children began to be seen less and less frequently until they finally disappeared completely. He recounts that the young Edward V, aware of his fate or simply overwhelmed by loneliness and fear, spent his days crying and asking for confession as if preparing for death. He also mentions that the doctor who treated them, a certain Dr. Argentine, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins through daily confession and penance because he believed that death was stalking him. This image of a child king resigned to his fate, seeking solace in religion while awaiting an inevitable end, is deeply moving and heartbreaking. From August 1483 onwards, sightings of the princes ceased completely. Silence descended upon them. It is in this vacuum of information that rumors, speculation, and accusations began to flourish. The most widespread and persistent version, as we have already mentioned, is that their murder was ordered by their uncle, King Richard III. This version was firmly established by historians of the Tudor dynasty, which succeeded Richard on the throne, and especially by Sir Thomas More in his History of Richard III, written around 1513 but published posthumously. More, although not a direct witness to the events, claimed to have based his account on sources close to the court and on the testimony of some of those allegedly involved. According to More, Richard III, obsessed with securing his throne and eliminating any possible threat, had commissioned Sir James Tyrrell, one of his most loyal and ruthless servants, to take care of the matter of the princes. Tyrrell, in turn, is said to have traveled to the Tower of London and, with the help of two henchmen, Miles Forrest, one of the prince's guards, and John Dighton, his own groom, entered the room where the children were sleeping and suffocated them with pillows and cushions. Their bodies, according to Morrow, were initially buried at the foot of some stairs in the White Tower, under a pile of stones, but later, on the orders of Richard, who supposedly regretted having buried them in such an unworthy place, they were exhumed and moved to a more secret and consecrated place, although Morrow does not specify where. This narrative, with all its vivid details and implicit moral condemnation of Richard III, became the canonical version of events and was immortalized by William Shakespeare in his famous historical drama Richard III, which contributed decisively to shaping the popular image of the king as a hunchbacked, monstrous tyrant and murderer of children. However, it is important to remember that both More and Shakespeare wrote during the reign of the Tudors, a dynasty that had a vested interest in demonizing the figure of Richard III, the last king of the House of York, in order to legitimize their own rise to the throne. Therefore, their accounts, while powerfully written, must be treated with caution from a historical point of view. Over the centuries, other theories and other possible suspects have emerged in the case of the disappearance of the princes in the tower. Some revisionist historians, especially in the 20th century, have attempted to exonerate Richard III, arguing that he had no sufficient motive to murder his nephews, since they had been declared illegitimate and he was already crowned king, or that the crime was perpetrated by others who had more to gain from their deaths. Among the alternative suspects mentioned are Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a former ally of Richard III, who helped him usurp the throne but rebelled against him a few months later, in the fall of 1483. Buckingham had his own distant aspirations to the throne, as he was a descendant of Edward III. Some suggest that he may have murdered the princes to frame Richard and facilitate his own rebellion, or even to pave his own way to the crown if the rebellion succeeded. However, Buckingham's rebellion failed, and he himself was executed by Richard, making his guilt less likely, although not entirely ruling it out. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, future Henry VII, the pretender to the throne of England from the House of Lancaster, who was in exile in Brittany and who would eventually defeat and kill Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, becoming the first king of the Tudor dynasty. For Henry, the existence of the princes in the Tower, although illegitimate, still represented an obstacle, as they were the natural heirs of the House of York and could be used by his enemies to question his own right to the throne, which was quite weak. Some historians have suggested that Henry may have ordered the murder of the princes after his victory at Bosworth, to eliminate any possible rivals. However, there is no direct evidence to support this theory, and it seems more likely that, if the princes were still alive in 1485, Henry would have displayed them publicly to discredit Richard and secure his own position. John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, or Sir William Stanley, other influential nobles of the time who may have had their own motives or acted on the orders of one of the main contenders. The truth is that, in the absence of conclusive evidence and direct, impartial testimony, the mystery surrounding the final fate of the princes in the Tower and the identity of their possible murderers remains unsolved. The climax of their death, therefore, is not a single well-documented moment, but an absence, a void, a silence that has lasted for centuries. The revelation, or lack thereof, is at the heart of this historical enigma. An archaeological discovery made in 1674 in the Tower of London seemed to shed some light, or perhaps more shadows, on the matter. During renovation work in the White Tower, workers found the skeletons of 2 children of ages consistent with those of the princes buried under a staircase. Although scientific identification was not possible at the time, King Charles II ordered that the bones be buried with honors in Westminster Abbey, in an urn designed by Sir Christopher Wren, under an inscription identifying them as the remains of Edward V and Richard of York. In 1933, the bones were exhumed and examined by forensic experts, who confirmed that they belonged to 2 children of approximately the same age as the princes, and that they were probably male and related. However, they were unable to determine with certainty the cause of death or the exact date of death, let alone the identity of the murderers. Modern DNA testing could, in theory, provide more conclusive answers, but so far no new exhumation and analysis of the remains has been authorized. Thus, the mystery of the princes in the Tower lives on, fueling popular imagination and historical debate. Were they suffocated on the orders of their uncle Richard III in the summer of 1483? Or was their end different, and perhaps even darker and more complex than tradition has told us? The Tower of London jealously guards its secret. The disappearance and alleged murder of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and Richard of York, in the summer of 1483, had immediate and profound consequences on the turbulent political landscape of England during the War of the Roses, and its echoes would resound loudly throughout the brief and turbulent reign of Richard III, contributing decisively to his downfall and the rise of the Tudor dynasty. The announcement of the prince's death, although never official or explicit on the part of Richard III, spread rapidly in the form of persistent and increasingly detailed rumors, both in England and on the European continent. The initial reaction of the court and the people was a mixture of horror, disbelief, and reverential fear at the apparent cruelty and determination of the new king. For many, the fact that Richard III had usurped the throne from his nephew and declared him illegitimate was already an act of excessive ambition and morally questionable. But the suspicion that he had also ordered the cold-blooded murder of 2 innocent children, his own nephews of royal blood, to secure his crown, made him, in the eyes of much of the public, a monster, a bloodthirsty tyrant unworthy of reigning. This perception, whether fair or not, irreparably undermined Richard III's legitimacy and popularity from the very beginning of his reign. Although some nobles supported him, whether out of loyalty, self-interest, or fear, many others began to conspire against him almost immediately, horrified by the alleged crime, or simply seeing the king's moral weakness as an opportunity for their own ambitions. The first and most important consequence of the prince's disappearance was the outbreak of a series of rebellions against Richard III in the fall of 1483, just a few months after his coronation. These rebellions, known as the Buckingham Rebellion, were led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who, paradoxically, had been one of Richard's main supporters in his rise to the throne. Buckingham's motivations for rebelling are complex and the subject of debate. Did he feel betrayed by Richard, who had not granted him the rewards he expected? Was he truly horrified by the murder of the princes and decided to act on moral principles? Or did he simply see an opportunity for his own distant aspirations to the throne? Whatever the case, Buckingham allied himself with supporters of the House of Lancaster and the remnants of the Woodville faction, and proclaimed his support for Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the Lancastrian pretender who was in exile in Brittany, as the legitimate candidate for the throne of England. The rebellion, however, was poorly coordinated and quickly crushed by Richard III's forces. Buckingham was captured and executed without ceremony in November 1483. But although the rebellion failed militarily, it had important political consequences. It demonstrated the fragility of Richard III's regime, the existence of considerable internal opposition, and above all, it consolidated the figure of Henry Tudor as the main unifier of all the forces opposed to the king. The fate of the princes' bodies, or rather the absence of them, became a propaganda weapon of the First Order. With no bodies to display and no official burial, the mystery surrounding their fate persisted, fueling all kinds of rumors and speculation. Richard III never offered a clear or convincing explanation of what had happened to his nephews. His silence was interpreted by many as a tacit admission of guilt. This lack of information was skillfully exploited by his enemies, especially Henry Tudor and his supporters, who spread throughout Europe the image of Richard as a cruel tyrant and murderer of children, presenting themselves as the avengers of the innocent princes and the restorers of justice and legitimacy. The disappearance of the princes also had a direct impact on marriage and dynastic politics. With the two direct male heirs of Edward IV eliminated, the main figure who held the hopes of the House of York was his older sister, Elizabeth of York. Henry Tudor, with great political astuteness, promised to marry Elizabeth of York if he succeeded in conquering the throne, thus uniting the two rival roses, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, and putting an end, at least in theory, to decades of civil war. This promise won him the support of many moderate Yorkists, who, although wary of the Lancastrians, hated or feared Richard III. The new questions that arose after the prince's disappearance did not concern so much whether they were dead or not. Most people took this for granted, but how, when, and by whose order they had been murdered. Was Richard III really the sole person responsible? Did he act alone, or did he have the complicity of other influential nobles? Were they murdered in the Tower, or taken to some other more secret location? These questions, although unanswered, continued to fuel political instability and distrust of the king. Richard III's brief reign, which lasted only 2 years, 1483 to 1485, was marked by the constant threat of conspiracies and rebellions and by a climate of suspicion and fear. Despite some attempts to rule justly and effectively and to promote certain legal reforms, he never managed to shake off the shadow of the alleged murder of his nephews. This stain on his reputation was a decisive factor in his ultimate downfall. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of mercenaries and exiles. Many English nobles, dissatisfied with Richard or simply hoping for a change of fortune, joined his cause. The decisive battle took place on August 22nd at Bosworth Field. Richard III, despite fighting with great personal courage, was betrayed by some of his top lieutenants, such as Lord Stanley, Henry Tudor's stepfather, and died in combat. His death ended the War of the Roses and the Plantagenet dynasty on the English throne. Henry Tudor was proclaimed king as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty, which would reign for over a century and profoundly transform England. The imminent chaos that could have resulted from the disappearance of the princes thus materialized in a new and definitive phase of the Civil War, which culminated in the fall and death of Richard III and the rise of a new royal house. Far from being resolved with Richard's death, the mystery of the princes in the Tower became one of the pillars of Tudor propaganda, which needed to justify Henry VII's usurpation and demonize the last king of the House of York. The disappearance and alleged murder of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and Richard of York, in the dark and infamous Tower of London in the summer of 1483, was not simply a horrific crime, however atrocious the act of murdering 2 innocent children of royal blood may have been. It was an event which, despite its mystery and lack of absolute certainty, cast a long, dense, and deeply disturbing shadow over the history of England, and whose echoes, magnified by literature and historiographical debate, resonate with surprising force to this day. The legacy of this tragedy is complex, multifaceted, and in many respects, still controversial. In the immediate political arena, as we have already analyzed, the disappearance of the princes was a crucial factor, perhaps the most decisive, in the delegitimization and downfall of King Richard III. Although he had usurped the throne of his nephew Edward V through skillful legal and political manipulation, the widespread suspicion that he had also ordered the cold-blooded murder of the two children to secure his crown made him, in the eyes of many of his contemporaries, both in England and throughout the rest of Europe, a monstrous tyrant, a new Herod, unworthy of wearing the crown and receiving the loyalty of his subjects. This perception, whether or not it was entirely accurate, irreparably undermined the basis of his power, fueled conspiracies and rebellions against him, and greatly facilitated the path for Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a pretender with considerably weaker dynastic rights, to rally the opposition, defeat him at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, and seize the throne, thus inaugurating the influential and long-lasting Tudor dynasty. In fact, one of Henry VII's first acts as king was to repeal the Titulus Regius, the parliamentary act that had declared the children of Edward IV illegitimate, thereby restoring their legitimacy and, incidentally, that of his own wife, Elizabeth of York, the elder sister of the missing princes, whom he married to unite the rival houses of Lancaster and York and end the bloody War of the Roses. This union and the subsequent Tudor propaganda, which sought to portray Richard III as the last and most depraved of medieval tyrants, contributed decisively to forging the black legend of Richard, a legend that would reach its literary peak in the work of William Shakespeare. The figure of the princes in the Tower, innocent victims of their uncle's boundless ambition, thus became a powerful symbol of the cruelty of power and the fragility of innocence in a world dominated by intrigue and political violence. Their story, steeped in pathos and mystery, has fascinated entire generations and inspired countless works of literature, theater, film, and art. From Sir Thomas More's moving History of Richard III, which laid the foundations for the traditional version of events, to contemporary historical novels and television series, the enigma of the princes remains a recurring theme that appeals for its blend of human drama, political intrigue, and unsolved mystery. On a deeper level, the case of the princes in the Tower also raises important questions about the nature of historical truth and the limits of our knowledge of the past. Despite more than 5 centuries of research, debate, and archaeological discoveries, such as the bones found in the Tower in 1674, we still do not have absolute certainty about what really happened to Edward V and Richard of York. Were they murdered on the orders of Richard III, as the majority tradition maintains? Or were they victims of some other conspiracy? Or did they even survive in secret, as some have wanted to believe? The lack of direct and irrefutable evidence, the bias of many contemporary and later sources, and the complexity of the political interests at stake make this one of the most fascinating and frustrating cold cases in history. This uncertainty, however, also reminds us of the importance of methodological rigor, critical skepticism, and intellectual humility when confronting the enigmas of the past. It teaches us that history does not always offer clear and definitive answers, and that we must often settle for approximations, probabilities, and the acceptance that there are secrets that we may never fully uncover. The moral or existential lesson to be learned from the tragic story of the princes of the Tower is, perhaps, that of the terrible vulnerability of childhood and innocence in the face of the excessive ambition and cruelty of political power. Their fate reminds us, with chilling harshness, that in the struggle for the throne and for dynastic survival, children, even those of royal blood, can become mere pawns, obstacles to be eliminated, scapegoats for the sins and ambitions of adults. Their story is an indictment of tyranny, violence, and the primacy of reason of state over the most basic principles of humanity and justice. And so, the cold and damp Tower of London, which has witnessed so many dramas and tragedies throughout its 1,000-year history, continues to jealously guard within its walls the ultimate secret of the 2 young princes who one day disappeared inside. Their absence, their silence, their anonymous grave continue to challenge our conscience and our thirst for truth. What became of them? Who was truly responsible for their fate? The question, like a persistent echo in the dark corridors of history, continues to resonate through the centuries, inviting us not to forget, to continue investigating, and above all, to reflect on the profound and often terrible contradictions of power and the human condition. I invite you to share your own opinion in the comments. Do you think Richard III was the murderer of his nephews, or do you consider other theories more plausible? What aspect of this historical enigma do you find most fascinating or disturbing? And if these chronicles of the darkest, most intriguing, and most momentous endings of royalty fascinate you and invite you to reflect, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like us, and join us on our next journey into the depths of the past, where there are always new mysteries to uncover and new lessons to learn, 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 and new